Hey, everybody. Thank you for being here. I have the extraordinary pleasure today of interviewing former Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, who represented the state of Ohio from 2007 to 2025 and who has recently decided to jump into the race for the seat that was vacated when now Vice President JD Vance went into the administration. So he's looking for a 2-year term to replace JD Vance and to see where things go from there. Thank you so much for being with us today, Senator.
Heather, thank you. It's such an honor because I know how many people look to you, and I among them read you every single day, and um, can't believe your extraordinary your insight, but your extraordinary output that you can. My wife is a columnist, and I know how hard it is, and how much work it takes, and how prolific you are. So thank you.
Well, we're all doing this together, but that does raise the question of why did you decide to get into this race?
Yeah, I didn't expect to run again, and uh, I but if February, March, April, you could see how much worse the country was getting. That nobody expected all of this to happen, and the more Connie and I talked about it, the more we decided we couldn't stay on the sidelines. I can win this race. I know that based on a whole lot of things in my state, and people are seeing this. People are seeing prices go up. They're concerned about Medicaid cuts in my state alone. 490,000 people in a state of 12 million, 490,000 people are likely to lose their insurance. A dozen hospitals will likely close in rural areas. And Heather, you live in a pretty rural area and you know what a local hospital means in terms of employment, in terms of taking care of people in very difficult situations. So much, and then the huge tax cut for rich people that just piles on the federal deficit. So we couldn't stay in the sidelines. We got in this race, and the response is less about me than it's been about people all over the country wanting to have hope. And we raised a huge amount of money the first day, more than anybody had ever raised in any Senate race because of that, because people are grasping for something. They want change. They can't believe what's happened to their country. So many of those people read you every day, and that's what matters.
Well, so that's actually the place I want to start is what are you hearing from people in the state of Ohio about where they feel the country is in this moment?
Well, people will say, I mean, I at a grocery store, at a drugstore, just walking down the street, doing the gas station, whatever. People, I mean, people come up to me more than I've ever seen ever in my public life, and they will say things like, "I didn't vote for this. I didn't vote for 500,000 people losing their health insurance. I didn't vote for higher prices, even though they've been led to believe that would stop." They didn't vote for tax cuts for the richest people in the country. They didn't vote for this huge chasm to get wider between sort of the poor and the rich, or the middle class and the rich. And so that's the first thing I hear. And people are pretty incredulous about how all this has happened so quickly. And so, I mean, in that sense, that's why I couldn't stay on the sidelines, because people are saying things they've never really said before. And then on a sort of macro way, the number of people that have shown up in conservative areas of my state and the country, shown up for demonstrations, shown up to protest something. The best example, perhaps, during the Elon Musk first months, there were 10 people protested on a Saturday at a Tesla dealership in Columbus. And within 3 weeks, once a week, there were 1,000 people there. And that's the kind of passion and sentiment. And the good news about that is I think that rolls into the 2026 elections. But the other good news about it is I think it leads us to a more activist citizenry in this country. And I go back, and you've talked to me about, and I'll explain in a minute, this pin I wear. This represents, in many ways, represents citizen movements. And it wasn't like in the 1930s, Wall Street all of a sudden said, we ought to have Social Security because too many old people are poor. It was really a citizens driven, we've got to do something, and pushing Congress to do it. And that's what I hope this energy now out there, this sentiment to stop something bad from happening, will roll into something good happening come election or two away from now.
It's funny you say that because one of the reasons that Frances Perkins started with the elderly in Social Security arguments was because they vote. And she said, we've wanted to protect disabled workers and we've wanted to protect children for a long time, but they don't vote. One, because they have to move around a lot, and the other because they're too young. So if we start with older people who do vote, politicians will pay attention. And that's exactly what happened. She figured that that would be a good way to make sure that we could, in fact, put a social safety net in place. I always loved that story. But it actually makes me wonder about why that you think people didn't recognize that this is what was coming in 2024. And I want to throw out one, the idea that there is a level of dishonesty, a lack of authenticity in our politicians today that is unprecedented on the one hand, or maybe just because people thought that the social safety nets and the regulations and the agencies we had in place would never go away. Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, well, I think it's both. I think that um, Republicans often during my career have tried made attempts to privatize Medicare and made attempts to privatize Social Security. They think they can get away with it, and then they see people rise up and say no. They generally fail, but I think the voters have heard that enough times that maybe they don't really believe it's going to happen. But the other thing is clearly on the internet, and people are able. It's what's the line about that Mark Twain said? A lie can make its way around the world before you get your socks on, or whatever he said that you probably can cite that I can't. But I think that they've done so much damage that way, and believing and getting people to believe things that aren't true, or getting covering up things that are true. And that's a big part of our fight. And that's again, that's why shows like this and your columns and what my wife writes and others are so important to speak the truth to this. I hate the cliche "speak truth to power," but it really is that, and that's kind of where that's what this citizen activism that we're all in this together and we're all fighting for really matters. And it's the reason I had to get off the sidelines and do what I can do, and that is in this case run for the Senate. You write and think, and that's what you do, and other people organize demonstrations, and that's what they do.
And we're all doing what we can in this moment. And that actually brings up why I always thought your career was so interesting in the Senate, is because we didn't have a lot of voices for labor. And it always struck me that you were one of, not the only one, but one of the major voices for labor. And I would love to hear where you think labor fits into this election. And also, one of the things that I noticed when you were talking on a show recently is that pin you wear. And I know the story behind the pin, but it's a great story. And I think people ought to know that story. So, can you start with where you think labor fits into 2026, 2028, and going forward in the United States, but then why you wear that pin?
Okay, let's flip it if I could and talk about the pen because that leads me into the other. 30 years ago, I was at a Workers' Memorial Day rally in Lorain, Ohio, a city on the banks of Lake Erie, and a steelworker walked up and gave me this pin. It's a depiction of a canary in a bird cage. And if you followed labor history or just American history, you know that the mine worker took the canary down in the mines. If the canary died, the mine worker got out. The mine worker knew he was on his own. He didn't have a union, usually a he, didn't have a union strong enough or a government that cared enough to protect him. So this symbolizes to me worker safety. I've worn it ever since. I print up a new edition every year, every time I run, with a year on it, and it speaks to activism. It speaks to not just worker safety. It speaks to the creation of Social Security that you and I talked about with Secretary Perkins. It speaks to citizens demanding Medicare, that the insurance companies didn't all of a sudden in the 1960s say, people that are old ought to have health care. No, we organized, we demanded it. It speaks to civil rights, where Southern segregationist senators and sheriffs didn't all of a sudden say, hey, everybody should vote. We should pass voting rights. No, it was, we all know, we're all very familiar with those demonstrations and fights and involvement and history. It did, and by workers generally on creating, I'll get to that one, creating labor law in the 1930s. Part of the Roosevelt early years were not just Social Security, but were minimum wage and were labor law on the 8-hour day and overtime and all of those things. And so the labor is so intricately involved with all of these social movements. Labor's probably a little more conservative now, for whatever reasons. I'm not sure, and I have some opinions, but we were all disappointed at the labor vote this year. Harris in Ohio probably won the labor vote, organized labor votes by 1 or 2 or 3%. Um, I did better. I didn't do enough better, I guess. And it's part of it is we don't talk to workers. You don't. The fact that you said at the beginning, one of very few voices in the Senate on behalf of labor and organized labor and workers generally, tells me our problem, that we're not speaking to them, we're not listening to them. This Dignity of Work Institute I spoke about earlier that we started. It's a national organization. It's a foundation. It's an institute, but it's more activist than sort of an analytic. But one of the things we've done is a bunch of focus groups and polling, and one of the things we found that overwhelmingly people of across, whether they work for tips, whether they're taking care of an aging parent, whether they're combining oats, whether they're working on a salary, whether they're hourly wage earners, they really do feel overwhelmingly the system's rigged, and think the system is even more rigged today than it was a year ago. They also think that we expect corporations to rig the system. They also now believe that elected officials are in bed with corporate interests. And what has sort of set me apart in this job, I think, and what will get me back to the Senate and winning next, like 14 months from now, is that I've taken on those corporate interests. Because politics is, to me, it's not left or right. It's whose side are you on, and if you're willing to stand up to those interests on behalf of workers, organized and not organized workers. If you're willing to do that, you not just win elections, you blaze a path in the Senate and in government that you should blaze, and fighting for working people. So labor has been a disappointment. Organized labor electorally has been a disappointment. They're a disappointment too, in that they haven't grown. They've shrunk over time. But the good news, and Heather, you know this because you pay so much attention to this kind of thing. The good news is this generation of young people is the most pro-union generation in our lifetimes, and that tells me there's a lot of hope for unions to organize better and to make sure that organized workers understand better the history of labor and who's been on their side in all these fights.
So it's interesting you put it that way because the other thing that jumps out about the 1930s and the New Deal regulations that we got that tried to create a level playing field so that everybody could be treated fairly were, of course, the laws about regulations of the stock market, making sure that people couldn't just, corruptly do whatever they want. And I always think that's interesting to talk about because when we think about laborers asserting its rights in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, people forget that we didn't get the regulation of banking, for example, because people like you and me said, hey, we need to have regulation of banking. We had that because businessmen understood that if there wasn't a level playing field in securities, for example, on the stock market, in the way people lent money, they couldn't be entrepreneurs and start new businesses. And I find this moment that we're in really interesting because we're seeing that again, where the administration is taking a cut of businesses and putting its finger on the scale for one business or another. And as I say, that was a thing in the 20s, but you saw a huge pushback in how we got securities and exchange commissions, for example. And I wonder the degree to which what we are seeing is less about labor or employers or whatever, but taking a stand against people who are traditionally seen as their enemies, so much as people working together to say, "Hey, we got a real problem. No matter where you are in this society, unless you are one of the people rigging the system, you're in real trouble, and we need to unrig the system." And that's not just about labor; it's also about entrepreneurs, which is what we saw in the 20s and in the 1890s.
And what we're seeing today. I mean, there are three good examples. Well, two good examples most recently about what's happening with the predictability in business and what you're saying with regulation. One is the attacks on Lisa Cook and on the Federal Reserve. That's taking away some of that productivity. I mean, I guess let me back up for a second. You have said that it's the regulation. It's also the predictability, so that business knows about their investments and what's going to happen. And the undermining of predictability is the Lisa Cook attack on the Social Security, on the Federal Reserve, the firing of the the uh, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the firing of the director there, and just the unevenness of business being able to be predictive, the economy being more predictable, and that's Trump. That's the what he's done with scatterbrained use of tariffs, the sort of the unevenness of tariffs. It's taking over parts of companies like this, and I think business people are going to begin to understand it's attacks on these rules unevenly at the SEC and other places. It's also all the other things that are undermining what business thinks it needs and does need for a good economy. So the problem, though, the political problem is tax cuts, pardon the verb, tend to trump everything else for so many people in corporate America. And as long as they're getting big tax cuts, they're willing to take a lot of other things with it, unfortunately. And that's our challenge in part is to organize them so they understand that there is way more to it than this tax cut this year. It's what it does. It's undermining our economic system far more than it should.
So that actually brings us, I think, full circle to the idea, as you started out talking about the idea of American individuals coming together in protests, in talking about what they care about for society, versus a small group of people who are looking to consolidate power in the United States. It's really pretty stark if you look at our history, at what you're seeing right now. But when you think about that, what do you want for this moment and for America going forward? And I'm going to remind you of something that you probably don't remember, and that's that the first time you ever really came across my radar screen, as aside from somebody who I just watched and listened to, was I had written a piece that referred to the Rust Belt. And I got a text the next morning from you. I assume you got my number from your wife, who's a colleague, and it said, "Please don't talk about my state as part of, this old idea that it is in economic trouble. We are the opportunity belt." And I thought that was really wonderful, and I've used it ever since. So I assume that you are thinking about the United States and Ohio in particular in a forward-looking way, as opposed to simply stopping what we're seeing happening.
Yeah, I do remember saying that. I didn't remember saying opportunity belt, but I do remember talking. I have noticed that you have used the term Rust Belt.
That actually jumped out to me because you're a senator, or you were at the time were a senator, and you took the time to reach out to a writer you didn't know to say, "Please don't talk about my state that way," which I thought was really, really impressive.
Thank you. I'm impressed that you never used the word since. So
I have
for me,
not.
it started. I grew up in Mansfield, Ohio, an industrial town of 50,000 people, and went to Johnny Appleseed Junior High, Mansfield Senior High School, with the sons and daughters of steel workers at Empire Detroit, of rubber workers at Mansfield Tire, of electrical workers at Westinghouse, and auto workers at GM, and all the millwrights and bricklayers and roofers and carpenters and electricians that service those plants. And by the time I was in my early 20s, many of those companies had moved, shut down, and moved to the anti-union South. Had moved to Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, wherever. And within 10 years, they were moving overseas. And it really formed my politics that and my mother was, it's a bit of a side, my mother was started the Ohio Council of YWCA's, and the YWCA's mission for 100 years, its stated mission to eradicate racism and to empower women. So those two things really came together to form my view of the world, my political view of the world. And I thought in terms of, what do we do about this? These communities that have been so undermined by corporate greed and the resulting loss of jobs. And to me, it's a big part of that's the labor movement, because the labor movement, if everybody carried a union card, one more thing. I remember at the time hearing that the presidents of these companies in Mansfield, Ohio, they made perhaps 25 times what the average worker made. Now that number is two, three, four, 500 times what the average worker made, depending on how you measure it, and when you do it, I guess. But that imbued me a sense of social justice about and economic justice about how we address these kinds of issues. But if workers are at the table, this kind of stuff doesn't happen nearly to the degree it has in the past. We wouldn't have NAFTA. We wouldn't have these kinds of trade agreements. I still hear workers talk about NAFTA in Ohio, which was 30 years ago. Um, we would have a different tax system. We would have a different economic system overall, and probably a different justice system too. So I put a lot of this at the sort of moral base of workers organizing for better conditions for their members, but also knowing the labor movement affects so much beyond their own membership.
So if you were, projecting what you would like to see in the United States, in our lifetimes, what does that look like to you?
I think I guess I go back to the foundation of workers being central in this economy. The Dignity of Work Institute, which we started less than a year ago, is really about how do we listen to workers? How do we have them at the table? How do we empower them? It's not what we tell workers they ought to think; it's what they collectively tell us. And I guess I would yearn for a government that made it easier to organize, passing the PRO Act. That's sort of the easier, more simple first step, but also forcing members of Congress and people and policymakers to actually listen. I started in politics many years ago in the legislature, and I spent most Fridays when we were out of session at veterans halls and union halls, mostly union halls, listening to people coming off their second shift or whatever, their first shift, coming off their shift, and what they wanted to see in their lives and their families and their world. I guess I would like to find a way that sort of forces members of Congress. Maybe you need dramatic change in campaign fundraising for sure, campaign finance, to force us to listen bring those people to the table and not just affluent people that are have lobbyists in Washington at the table because they really do run everything, as you know.
That actually does raise a question, and that is in a system that is so rigged for people who can attract all this money, what do we do about that? Like, do you play in that system or do you fight back against it? You did mention that you raised a ton of money on the first day you announced. How should we think about that?
Well, yes, and yes, you have to play in it to get to office to be able to do something about it. I think that one of the first things we should do in the Senate and the House when we can get the votes to do it, and I don't know if that's sooner rather than later. It needs to be sooner. Is to repeal the Citizens United law ruling where people can where a billionaire, look what Elon Musk did, and one rich person, really rich person, could spend that kind of money. I had more money spent against me than I believe any Senate campaign in the country ever. At least it was the most last year. It was something along the lines of $200 million. I'm not whining about it because it's the system, but we've got to deal. We need to
Crazy.
change labor law. We need to change voter access laws, and we need to change Citizens United. The cascading of tidal waves of dollars into these political campaigns.
I'm gonna agree with that one. I'm interested in what you say about listening to workers because I used to be a waitress in Oklahoma, and it used to kind of make us bonkers that the wait staff had really good ideas about things that could make the restaurant work a lot better and that would attract more people because we knew what foot traffic looked like, we knew what our big times were, and so on. And the management steadfastly treated us as if we were simply automatons who had no idea of how to run the thing. And you'll be shocked to hear it went under within a couple of years after a lot of us left. So I get it. I get that we need to have better conversations. I'm going to leave
And
you.
well, that's the system. I mean, that take that little story in Oklahoma and blow it up and make it more economy wide. And I think that companies with good labor management relations. I mean, they fight, they disagree, they butt heads, but they're better run companies because workers have a seat at the table. And so I think that should be the case everywhere. It isn't, and it could be at some point.
Do you know, I got a letter once from somebody who was a mechanic in an older mechanic in a factory, and he lamented the days back when people that we had lost the days back when people had popular mechanics at home, for example, because he said they were always encouraged to see what would make the company work better, what would make the factory work better, and that shut down in the 80s and 90s, and they were simply told to do their jobs. I thought that was a really interesting observation.
And they would, if they had a union in that company, they would be listened to better because the union could demand it, not just at the bargaining table every 3 years, but in the course of labor management relations that are also negotiated.
So, one final question for you. One of the things about sort of citizen activism in this moment is the degree to which people are looking for things that they can do to protect American democracy. You talk a lot about labor. What would you say to people who are interested in those issues or in democracy in general should be doing in this moment to try and preserve the best of what we've had in the past and make it better for the future?
Well, it's what we talked about earlier, Heather. It's whatever you can do best, do. And for Heather, it's for you. It's writing this almost daily column, doing podcasts like you're doing. It's finding a way to educate people and reach out and encourage people. For me, it's getting off the sidelines and running for the Senate. For some, it's going to City Hall and demonstrating. For others, it's writing, making calls, writing letters, to elected officials and demanding they answer. It's encouraging a member of Congress to do a town hall so they can speak out. And this will sound very much about me for a moment, but it's contribute to political campaigns. And my people can come to sherrodbrown.com and give 5 or 10 or $25. We raised $3 million with the average contribution of $53. In every Ohio county, someone contributed. So those kinds of things matter. And if we're going to beat Citizens United in the tidal waves of money that cascade in these political campaigns, we can beat them with small contributions because it's hundreds of thousands of people. We think 100,000 people donated that first day to me all around the country. So whatever you can do, it's demonstrating, it's being Heather, it's knocking on doors, it's writing letters, it's contributing small amounts of money. All those things, we can blunt and block a lot of this bad stuff happening to the country, and then we move into the midterms and take the country back.
From your lips, as they say. Thank you so much for being here, Senator. And I look forward to seeing how this race and how the country shapes up over the next couple of years.
Thanks so much.